Hello everyone. So it's been a little while, but we're back and I'm hoping to upload quite a few videos over the next few weeks that's going to help you get ready for A-level RS. So today we're going to look at Hume. So Hume comes up at a few different points in the course. He comes up mostly in philosophy, but in other places too. And he's just someone who it's really useful to know a little bit of background to, as well as obviously knowing what you could be asked questions on. And making links between Hume's ideas is another thing that it's really good to be able to do, because particularly for dialogues, you don't want to be compartmentalizing and thinking, oh, well, if he's got a view on miracles, then that's not relevant to everything else. It doesn't work like that. So hopefully I'll help you do a little bit of joined up thinking here as well. Okay. So here he is, David Hume, Scottish historian, philosopher. Not everybody's a fan of Hume. He had sort of links to the slave trade, which is obviously not good today. He was quite wealthy, but for the point of view of what we're looking at, we need to think of him largely as an empiricist. So what that means is he wasn't a religious man. He was what we would now call an atheist, but he was also a little bit careful about not saying officially that he was, because this was at a time when the church still held a lot of power, and it could have severely damaged his career if he had been open about his lack of religious belief. And in fact, it did damage his religious career because he was denied some academic positions. But for us, what we need to think about is particularly what empiricism means. One of Hume's most famous quotes, and we'll look at it again later, is "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence." So he didn't think human reason was completely infallible. He didn't think it was perfect. He thought it had limitations, but he generally thought it's wise to believe whatever we have the most evidence for. Because of that, he was pretty critical of religious belief because he felt that there just wasn't evidence for it. He also held what we would call a naturalistic worldview. That means he thought we could learn about the world through observation, through evidence, through science. So he was around at the time of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a time in the 18th century when religion started to lose its authority a little bit, because it had pretty much an iron grip on intellectual authority up to that point. Science as we know it today was really on the rise. And because of that, Hume's a major critic of arguments for the existence of God. So the two out of the three arguments you've got to know, the design, the cosmological and the ontological, Hume is a named critic on the spec for 2 out of 3 of those. So you do need to know what he says and why he says it. So let's get into that. All right. So Hume's criticism of design arguments, you have to be careful here because he isn't criticising Paley directly. That wouldn't be possible because Hume was alive before Paley. So they never would have met, they never would have encountered each other. Even so, Hume manages to spot problems with Paley's version of the argument almost before Paley did them. And that's because Paley wasn't the first person to come up with a version of the design arguments. Design arguments had been around for a long while, and Hume had problems with them. So 4 of the main criticisms that you need to know about are here. So he would have had a big problem with the watch analogy, even though he wasn't technically familiar with it, because he thought analogies comparing the universe to a machine were flawed. He was saying, actually, if we look at the universe, it isn't like a machine. It isn't like somebody put it together in bits. It's more like a holistic living thing. And therefore, to compare it to something like a machine is problematic. You can't really do it. He also rejected the idea that any designer had to be the Christian God, the God of classical theism. even if he was willing to accept the idea of a designer, he didn't see why that had to be God and why therefore that proved the existence of the Christian God. It could have been many designers, or it could have been a God who was flawed, or many gods who were flawed. So essentially, design might equal designer, but designer doesn't equal God. That's one way of putting that. Another problem he had was looking at the nature of the universe and thinking that it must point to a perfect designer because it's not a perfect design. Why is there suffering? Why are there things that don't work well? For him, that was a real threat to the idea that there was a designer God. And finally, this is a really good window into his kind of empirical thinking. He doesn't think it's possible to work out how universes are made from looking at one universe, which is all we have. So if you think about it, if you encountered, one watch or one phone or one car, and that was all you ever saw, you wouldn't really probably be able to tell that much about it unless you could compare it to others. Hume's saying the same thing here. How do we know much about the universe when we only have one universe to look at? We have nothing to compare it to. So our sense experience is limited. And if a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, he's arguing there that there just isn't enough evidence to go on. So those were his problems with the design argument. Here is what he said about the cosmological argument. So there's two critics that you need for the cosmological argument. Hume is one, Russell is the other. So make sure that you're familiar with what Russell says as well. Now, because this is an argument from Aquinas, who was much longer ago, Hume would have been familiar with Aquinas and his ideas. So it's okay when you're writing to say Hume criticised Aquinas, but for the design argument, I wouldn't say Hume criticised Paley. Okay, so his criticisms here. We've got the fallacy of composition. So what this is the idea that just because everything in the universe has a cause, it doesn't mean that the universe itself does. So an example of the fallacy of composition is something like every human being has a mother, therefore the human race has a mother. Now that doesn't work. And Hume thought that using the same logic, you could say that it's a fallacy to say that because everything in the universe is caused, the universe itself must have a first cause too. Now, there are ways you can argue against that. He might not be right about that, but you do need to know that it's a criticism he held. Aquinas rejected infinite regress because he thought there must be a beginning. There had to be a beginning. The universe couldn't just go backwards in time forever. Hume disagreed. Hume's open to the possibility that it goes back in time forever. And again, that's because we have no evidence, we have no proof to say that there must have been a beginning. In our experience, things tend to have beginnings, but it doesn't follow logically that therefore the universe must be like that as well. So Hume's open to the possibility of infinite regress. He doesn't think that that's not a possibility. And then in a similar way to what he said about the first cause, in a similar way to what he said about the design argument, sorry, even if there was a first cause, even if there was a beginning, there's no clear reason to believe that this was the Christian God. So Hume was writing before the Big Bang theory was a well-known theory, but if he was around today, he would probably have agreed with that. He would have said that's a sufficient explanation. You don't actually need anything else. Okay, the next time we encounter Hume on the spec is for miracles. Now, for miracles, there are two scholars that you need, Hume and Wiles, and you're doing a sort of a compare and contrast of their ideas, mostly a contrast because they're pretty different. And philosophically, they're coming at it from different standpoints. So Hume is a realist, Wiles is an anti-realist. Now, a realist doesn't mean he thinks miracles are real. it means that when he defines a miracle, he's defining something that would be a real world event if it happened, but he doesn't think they happen. So don't be sucked into the belief that realist equals real and actually happens, because it's not. Hume is just simply talking about miracles as being potential real world events if they happened, but they don't in his thinking. His view is that miracles are extremely unlikely, to the point that he doesn't think that they are possible. There's a few reasons why. There's a few criticisms that he has. I haven't gone into them all here because that would be quite a lot. But his arguments are that human testimony is unreliable. People want to think they've seen miracles. People trick themselves into thinking they've seen miracles. They're told that what they've seen is a miracle, but none of that actually makes it true that they've seen a miracle. Most miracle stories come from what he calls ignorant and barbarous nations. Now, he might be being a little bit of a snob here, but what he means is that a lot of miracles in tradition, particularly in Christian tradition, they come from ancient times when people didn't really know any better, in his view, or they're based in superstition rather than science and evidence. Let's just move on to a few quotes. Have a look at the one in the top left-hand corner. This is Hume's definition of a miracle. So this is what he lays out as his definition of a miracle, and then he uses this to show why he thinks it's so unlikely that they happen. Kind of borderline impossible. It's a transgression of the laws of nature by the volition of the deity or the interposition of some invisible agent. So for Hume, a miracle would have to break the laws of nature. It would have to be willed by God or caused by some sort of agent who's outside of our normal way of working, our normal space and time. Because that's his definition, that's the bar that it would have to clear. That's a very high bar, and that's why he thinks miracles don't actually happen, because events of that nature in the real world do not take place. That's his view. The quote next to that, if you just sort of travel across to the top right, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavours to establish. So again, Hume thinks we should believe what there's the most evidence for. There is massively more evidence that miracles don't happen than that they do. So if one happened, there'd have to be so much evidence for him to accept it that it would have to basically rewrite everything that we think we know, and he just doesn't see that happening. We've got a nice little quote at the bottom here, but why may not the material universe be the necessary existent being? So this is pushing back against the idea in Aquinas' thinking that there must be a necessary being and that that necessary being is God. Hume is suggesting here, why can't the universe itself be the necessary being? We're assuming that the universe has a cause, but why can't the universe contain its own cause? He doesn't see a problem there. And then definitely a good one for Hume, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. That makes it really, really clear that he's a scientific, empirical thinker. Okay, finally, just to finish off, Hume also does come up in compatibilism, but he can't be asked specifically about his thinking. So you need to know what compatibilism is. You need to know how it fits in with free will and determinism and moral responsibility. So this is a year 2 ethics topic. It's useful to know what Hume said because it gives you a scholar to talk about with compatibilism, and that's always a good thing to have if you're aiming for a high grade. So Hume accepts compatibilism. He thinks that the universe is pretty determined, but he thinks that certain actions performed by humans are free because the cause of them is internal rather than external. So he argued that when we act in accordance with what we want, we do so freely. Because for Hume, freedom isn't randomness. Freedom is very deliberate and kind of controlled by us. but because it's coming from within us and not being forced anything from outside, it counts as free. So to give you an example, if you make a choice to study because you want good grades, that's coming from within you. That's a free choice. And it's still free, even if your desire has been shaped by past experiences or upbringing, or you've been, just raised to think that it's a really good idea to study if you want good grades. Hume thinks that doesn't really matter, because if you make the choice to do it, that's still a free choice, because you could have done otherwise. You could choose not to study. So even though it's an internal cause, and that's still a cause, it counts as free. Now, that's not dead straightforward. Compatibilism isn't dead straightforward. But what Hume's saying is that he doesn't think that there's any problem with saying that certain human actions are free, even in a deterministic universe. And a deterministic universe actually makes it easier for human choices to mean something, because we can see where they've come from. They're not just random and chaotic. All right, that's enough of Hume for now. Coming up next, I'm hoping to do another one of these on John Hick, who is another scholar that comes up in several places. So look out for that. If you're new to the channel, it's great to have you. Please subscribe, tell your friends, tell your teachers, tell people in your classes that these videos are available for free, and work hard. I'll see you soon.